As Alan has already done, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land we're meeting here today, the Wulguru Kabar and Bindal people of the Townsville region, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I was a bit of a late fill-in for this presentation, and I wasn't sure I actually wanted to give it because some of the content can be quite complicated. I say that. However, I don't think anything I'm going to say is news to anybody in this room. So I guess what I want to start with is implore you to think about yourself, your position in your organisation, community, family, whatever it may be, and think about what difference you want to make going forward. So when I agreed to do this presentation last night, I got this notification on my phone. And my first question was, is that breaking news? And it's interesting, the two options that my Apple iPhone gave me: save for later or share. And I'm just wondering, it feels a little bit like a synonym for the way humanity is dealing with the existential threat of climate change. I feel like most of us are selecting the first option, and some of us are sharing, and still more are implementing actions. Earlier this year, I went to visit a friend in Lismore. That's their second story of their house. Across the road from their friend, who was featured in the ABC, who built a third-storey flood-proof refuge that flooded. So we went down and helped them rebuild their kitchen because they're limited in options. And it's not a unique story. And this is just snapshots of the last 4 or 5 months. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, except for the last image, which some of us here in the room, if you're local, can probably relate to. And we refer to these events not dissimilar to another large existential crisis facing humanity over the last couple of years. And these threats, being a marine scientist that I am here on the Great Barrier Reef, and the Great Barrier Reef being a canary in the coal mine of climate challenges, I look at what we're doing to the reef as emblematic of what we're doing to all of our natural ecosystems on the planet. Many threats, many pressures, many of them localised, regionalised, but internationally, climate change is going to change the face of the planet that we're living on quite substantially and probably more rapidly as we move forward. Prior to 2016, there were 2 mass bleaching events officially recorded across the Great Barrier Reef, one in 1998 and one in 2002. So we had a fairly sustained period of nice conditions, I guess you could say. And then between then and now, we've had 4 mass bleaching events across the Great Barrier Reef. The one in 2016 was particularly striking because the most affected area in that far northern region, where you can see lots of congested red dots, there's very little human habitation, not a lot of coastal construction, no farming, and not a lot of direct anthropogenic impacts. And so organisations like the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority and other marine scientists thought, well, this is our bastion of resilience. Even if, climate change is real and it's going to have a significant effect on our coral reefs, this area should remain resilient, healthy, and provide recovery impetus for the rest of the reef in Australia. Obviously that didn't play out as they expected, which resulted in actions that are looking at solutions to improve the health of the reef. The $100 million plus reef restoration and adaptation program, multi-institutional program looking at a range of solutions to improve its health. And again, you know, that word comes up again. The problem with the Great Barrier Reef, or reefs generally, is a complex message, because you can go to one part of the reef, like John Brewer Reef, offshore from Townsville here, on the right-hand side, and it looks amazing, and you go, wow, the reef's awesome. So if you go there, what's the story you tell? And then on the left-hand side, just a few kilometres down the road, is Lodestone Reef. Same general area, been heavily degraded, you know, minimal coral cover. And so what's the story you tell there? Similarly, after the bleaching in 2016, there were obituaries to the Great Barrier Reef. And this year, there's been reports by EIANZ of record coral cover across the Great Barrier Reef. If you don't look into the details, what you don't see is that my slide disappeared, but you also don't see that growth and increase in coral cover is driven by fast-growing weedy species that are more susceptible to the effects of increasingly intense climate change issues. So that's great if we don't have another cyclone or another mass bleaching event anytime soon. But if we go back to one of those first couple of slides, the likelihood of that happening, I gave you a snapshot of the last 6 months, but we could go back 2 years and that slide wouldn't have flooding in it. It'd be covered with images of bushfires, especially in Australia. And so the likelihood that we're not going to get more frequent, more intense storms is going to be challenging. So I guess the question begs is, hey, we're back. You know, what are we going to do about it? You know, the evidence is pretty clear what's happening to the Great Barrier Reef. The Marine Park Authority's own Outlook report paints a stark picture and clearly outlines the primary threat that the reef is facing. But I think you all know that I could stick a picture of a rainforest up there, or a mangrove, or a seagrass, you know, or wetlands, or whatever it might be, and climate change is the biggest threat to these natural systems. And one of the things that doesn't get addressed a lot, and it's certainly not done in policy because it's not ethical or politically correct, because we can't talk about limiting population growth, even despite the fact that the correlation between carbon emissions and population are pretty indisputable. You know, but most people think of population growth as supporting economic growth. And if that's your outcome, then great, but you're not really going to have a planet to get that economic benefit from. I lived in India and China for the best part of about 10 years, watched middle-class burgeoning economies in the two most populous nations want to live like Americans. Now, if they want to get to that consumption level, the resources are going to be depleted very rapidly. And I have very esteemed colleagues of mine who will say population is not a problem, because there are enough resources to support our burgeoning population. And that is true, and I will agree with them on that. However, the resources are not there if we all want to live the way we currently live. On our current projections, that fourth line in that graph says that we need 2.2 planet Earths, or resources equivalent to 2.2 planet Earths, to sustain our current way of living. So my colleague Adam Smith is actually meeting with this group of policy leaders and climate advocates in Canberra who came up with this report that said that Australia, politically and policy-wise, is ill-prepared to face the challenges of climate change. And so we're not looking at coral reefs anymore. We're looking at economically, culturally, politically, from an urban and natural perspective. And so the title of this talk was Leaders and Laggards. And I guess it comes back to my initial question, what do you want to be? And that's, I guess, what I'm asking you now, and what I'm asking you to consider after I've finished my talk, when you go home tonight, when you're back in your office. Do you want to be a leader in this space and make a difference or not? There's a website called the Climate Tracker, and it has this a whole range of data and statistics looking at what countries are doing and what they're pledging, and whether or not what they're doing is sufficient to meet the Paris Agreement of keeping our global temperature below 2 degrees centigrade and more close to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And most countries' pledges and current commitments are insufficient. Considering we're at the Australian, New Zealand chapter of the Environmental Institute, I figured we better focus on those two countries who are both insufficient and highly insufficient. So we're definitely not meeting the mark, but it's interesting to note how many countries are in the sufficient column. And you can delve deeper into the statistics here, and I'm not going to go through this in detail right now, but it talks about, and I can't read them from here, a range of different measurables that this independent research organisation, it's a consortium of research analysts looking at what the country has pledged and what they're doing to come up with these ratings. And some of them are insufficient, some of them are highly insufficient, critically insufficient. But I just want to point out too, the land resources were actually going into a net deficit with our bio capacity as well. But I urge you, if you want to find out what we are doing and what we're not doing, and this has actually been recently upgraded based on pledges by the Labor government. So this is actually an improvement on the previous government, and it's still not a really pretty picture. I'm not going to speak to these who are doing a good job so far and who are not. My colleague did some desktop analysis and selected a few organisations. Interestingly, below the line, many of them are energy companies, and it is definitely something that we as a community, as a country, as regional areas are going to have to face. We looked a bit deeper into what Townsville's doing. The Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority just released a report summarising some of the outputs of the Reef Guardian Councils. So these are councils that sign up to be reef guardians, to do actions or implement actions to protect the reef. And it shows that the local town council here is producing 120,000 tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions per annum, but it doesn't clarify what they're doing as actions to try and mitigate some of those, with a target for climate neutral of 2040. Again, how we get there is still a bit unknown. So that to me would seem aspirational rather than anything realistic. And so the EIANZ has these climate change special interest section on their website and has these actions that are being implemented as an organisation, as a community of practitioners, to try and create change amongst this community. Some of them, again, I don't have enough experience or knowledge to know whether or not these are being implemented. But I guess I'm asking you, and those of you who are my vintage may remember this fantastic film, what are you prepared to do to make a difference? And he says, yeah, well, Kevin Costner says, well, I'm prepared to do what I can. He goes, well, and then what are you prepared to do? Because it needs leaders to stand up and make a difference, implementing actions that are going to have a real impact. There's lots of documents out there how you can create sustainable change, but what we need to see is a bit more action from things that are being actually done. Just a bit of an example of the types of things we at Reef Ecologic do. We measure our impacts, we offset them, and we have targets for things that we want to do in the coming 6 to 12 months. And we try and influence others, which is a really big part of our corporate strategy at the moment. We produce infographics at the end of our financial year to try and share that knowledge and inspire others. You can see at the bottom there we have offset programs, and we run workshops where people who come and participate actually contribute as part of their attendance fee to offset emissions. When they're at those events, we workshop how we're going to offset them so that people learn about offset programs and become educated and aware and realise that these opportunities exist to them. Now, I agree, offsets are not the answer, but like we do in a lot of scientific pursuits, we use the best available science. So here we're using the best available approach until we can have negligible carbon emissions. Myself, I'm doing a PhD at James Cook University at the moment, and I've declared that I'm going to do a carbon neutral PhD candidature. So I'm measuring my impact and I will offset my emissions. You can see at the bottom too, I'm mitigating some of my impacts through riding a bicycle. And so those are the sort of actions, minor it may be, but it raises awareness and gets people to think about their own personal impact. So I guess, in conclusion, there's some personal stories in there, but I basically just wanted to ask you, who do you want to be?